And Walter, we'll have you stop your video.
Oh, okay. And the audio as well, right?
Yes. Thank you.
Hello, hello. How's everyone doing? Welcome to the IAC Fall Forum. I'm going to read a really brief intro and we'll kick off the event. So, welcome to the Fall Forum. The Institute of American Cultures at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukverum ancestors, Ahihirum, elders, and Eohimkim, our relatives, uh, and relations past, present, and emerging. This afternoon, scholars representing the four ethnic studies research centers at UCLA will be interviewed by a mentor on their current research. Our program will conclude with a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask our featured speakers, please do so in the Q&A box at any time. Now I'd like to introduce the Institute of American Cultures Vice Provost, Professor David Keliiaa.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Institute of American Cultures and our Ethnic Studies Centers, thank you for attending today's program, in which we are privileged to feature the research of our scholars who will be presenting soon. A distinction worth noting is that UCLA is the only University of California campus with organized research units, or ORUs, dedicated to ethnic and indigenous studies. With over 250 affiliated faculty members across our entire campus, we have been about advancing research for social justice for over 50 years. For the UCLA students here today, I would encourage you especially to check out the center websites and the Institute's website for scholarship and fellowship opportunities to help support your research and studies. May we all learn together today and be inspired to envision and to work toward a more just future. Thank you, and I'm turning it back over to Christopher.
Thanks so much. All right, let's get started with the event and our first conversation that's going to be coming up. So Our first session is called Unsettling Domesticity, Native Women and the San Francisco Bay Area Outing Program, which will feature Keliiaa, Assistant Professor of History at UC Santa Cruz, interviewed by Juliann, Anesi, Assistant Professor of Gender Studies. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. I think we're just waiting on some slides. My name is Keliiaa, really excited to be here. I was a master's student at UCLA and a former IAC grantee recipient when I did my studies, so it's really wonderful to be back. I just want to show really quickly, obviously this is a somewhat informational slide talking about today's talk, but I'm going to be talking about something called the Bay Area Outing Program, and this was a labor program that was based in the San Francisco Bay Area from about 1918 to about 1940. And we have an image here directly from the Oakland Tribune in 1927. And in the middle, we have matron Bonnie V. Royce. She was the first matron to manage the Bay Area Outing Program, and her entire role as a federal employee was to place Native women in homes throughout the Bay Area to work as domestic workers. And you'll see here she's surrounded by a lot of Native women, young Native women, and these are all Washoe and Paiute women who came from the Stewart Indian Boarding School to work during that particular summer in the Bay Area. I also want to share another slide just to give you a visual of kind of the spans of this program. So these are heat maps that demonstrate outing placements across the San Francisco Bay Area. Obviously, we have San Francisco on the left. Most of the positions were concentrated in the East Bay. So we see a lot, actually, you see quite a bit of yellow, and that area is actually Piedmont, California. So sort of within and around Oakland. And these maps actually represent over 700 outing placements. So these are homes that girls lived and worked in, and also, you know, kind of experiencing the Bay Area as well during that time. So these maps were designed by my research student, and it's just really exciting because now I do believe these will be a part of my book once we move forward. So I just wanted to give you a quick visual of that, and we can move into the conversation. So thank you so much, Juliann, for being here today and for interviewing me.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Katie. So I think we'll dive right into questions since we don't have much time. So I guess one of the first questions then would be, tell us a little bit about your project and maybe share a little bit of how you're approaching this project for our viewers and our attendees.
Yes, thank you. So my project, it's a book project, Unsettling Domesticity. Again, it looks at this outing program. And part of the ways that I come into this work is understanding that in the West, specifically, Indian labor was very integral in the sort of 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. But a lot of times it's kind of often ignored. The question of Indian labor, I think, is often something that's typically overlooked. So part of how I approach this is the first sort of main chapter is looking at the arc of domesticity throughout California. And that's really kind of tracing the Spanish, Mexican, and then American periods and looking at how Indian labor, whether coerced or essentially enslavement, was really integral actually to those time periods. And I jump into then describing what the Bay Area Outing Program looked like. For a lot of girls, they were coming from Western-based boarding schools like Sherman Institute down in Riverside or Chemawa up in Oregon. And for them, this would have been a really wonderful experience coming to Oakland to see the bright lights in the city. You know, a lot of these women came from rural communities. And for a lot of these women, it's a huge sea change because they're able to get wages. That was really integral for not only themselves, but also their families. And some of these girls were earning, you know, $25, $30, $40 a month, which was more than a lot of their parents would be able to earn either on reservation or in their more rural communities. So for a lot of girls, they were breadwinners. So I kind of look at those stories just to kind of set up the outing program. And then from there, I kind of talk about the sort of more heinous elements of the outing program. So one chapter looks at runaways specifically. And I traced girls that ran away from their placements, who wanted to go back home, who wanted to go back to their boarding school. We can kind of read into why those reasons are, but I do provide some of those reasons throughout those chapters. Another chapter specifically looks at Indian child removal. So the integral point of this particular program is that these are live-in housemaids. So the idea of having a child would be seen as a barrier to employment. So I look at the ways that matrons were essentially trying to separate Native children from their mothers in order to allow their mothers to continue to work and to labor. And I have 2 new chapters that I wrote in the last 2 years that take up the question of sexual surveillance and also STIs in the outing program, and looking at how outing matrons like Bonnie Royce, as you saw, attempted to even sterilize Native women to prevent, further Native children, to basically allow her to continue to work and to labor. And then another chapter looks at tuberculosis, which in the early 20th century was rampant throughout Indian country. And so I look at the cases of women who became ill in the Bay Area and essentially find that they had a really difficult time trying to get tubercular care. And largely this was because of their status as Native women who were not quite residents of the Bay Area. And basically Bay Area hospitals more or less refused to serve them for regular care. So I do a kind of broad approach through this book, but I'm trying to really get at not only Native women's agency, but understanding how structurally this program affected Native women's lives and their families.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I think you kind of touched on this, and I think it's just for the small amount of time that we have, maybe just kind of thinking about like your interventions in this work, specifically in fields like Indigenous studies,
Yes.
labor studies, as well as perhaps maybe gender studies.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, so one of, I think the biggest interventions is just thinking about Native people in the early 20th century. A lot of times it's just completely overlooked, and it's as if like Native people weren't there participating. But I think in thinking about the larger field, I think one of the interventions that I'm really trying to argue is really kind of reframing our understandings of settler colonialism and how that works. Settler colonialism, as a theory, often looks at how Native people are sort of dispossessed in regards to land. In fact, labor is not often a focus in that. So I think having the outing program and sort of showing this case study of this particular area, if you will, is really kind of trying to argue for understanding outing as something that was actually integral to settler colonialism. That what if we talk about not only the displacement of Native people on their land, but also putting Native people to work on that land. So I think it's kind of reframing that and rethinking how sort of gender works in colonization, how gender works in sort of the domestic home and all of that too.
Wonderful, thank you.
And I think
we'll pass it back over to our moderator, Christopher. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that very powerful presentation. We will move on to our second presentation right now. And our next section is called Peeling Apart Impressions, Investigating the Factors that Influence HBCU and PWI Perceptions, with Kiana Foxx, UCLA doctoral candidate in higher education and organizational change, interviewed by Walter R. Allan, Allan Murray, Carter Chair in Higher Education, Distinguished Professor of Education in Sociology and African American Studies.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased and honored for this opportunity to participate in this important conference. It celebrates all that we at UCLA have accomplished in the Inter-American Cultures program and all the various research centers, which are research arms of our academic departments. And as we all know, UCLA has just forged leadership in this area in terms of redefining the study of race, ethnicity, indigeneity, and literally retelling stories that had been obscured speaking truth to power and literally rewriting those stories and the history that we've been presented with so that it is more inclusive. This is really an important moment for our meeting and joining here and reminder of what the center has been able to, these centers and this program has been able to accomplish, in the sense that we see in the media yet another moment where there's an emphasis on what divides us. And this meeting is a reminder of all that we share in common, and is a very powerful remedy to what would divide rather than join us. I am, as I said, very pleased and proud to introduce Kiana. She is an ABD doctoral candidate in higher education. I'm speaking to you, by the way, from Ghana. And returning to Kiana, she just continues a stellar academic career that carried forward from her undergraduate years, Berkeley, then on to Teachers College at Columbia University, and then here finally to UCLA. I've already talked longer than I wanted to, Kiana, so if you will just jump in.
All right, thank you so much. I am very honored to be here. Thank you, Dr. Allan, for that beautiful introduction. I guess we can jump right into the questions.
Well, I've already talked, as I said, longer than I wanted to, so I'll give you 3 questions that you can address any way you see fit. Your summary of the project and what it is you accomplished in that project would be the first. I'm curious too for you to share with us your intellectual and life's journey that brought you to this place, and then reflect on where you go next, carrying the work that you've initiated and how you will build on it and how it will have significance for the lives that you are concerned about.
Okay, great. Those are wonderful questions. So just to talk a little bit more about my research. So this is my dissertation project, and in it, I am looking at how Black students are socialized to perceive historically Black institutions compared to how they're socialized to perceive predominantly white institutions. So in my research, I realized that through the media, there has been a lot of negative messages about historically Black colleges and universities, from messages about their fiscal mismanagement to messages about just general inferiority compared to predominantly white institutions. And so I was curious how those messages were affecting students, what messages students were generally hearing about historically Black colleges and predominantly white institutions, and how that affected not only how they saw them, but the decisions that they made to choose to apply to and pursue education at HBCUs and PWIs. So my dissertation is generally qualitative. I did do a general survey to kind of collect data to find out what initial thoughts were. And then I did interviews with students to find out more in-depth details about how these messages were affecting the decisions they were making and how it was informing their ideas about college. Generally, I think there has been, there's lots and lots of research on decision-making, but there has been less research on how race and racism influences those decisions. And so for my project, I really wanted to think about more deeply how race and racism in American society influences how students see different types of institutions and the things they choose to pursue. As for how I got here, I initially came in knowing that I wanted to do research on college access and student experience, especially for underrepresented students. How I got to this project was that I was working on a paper with my advisor, a HBCU paper on HBCU court cases. And I started to recognize all this wonderful work that HBCUs were doing and that I had not been aware of until that moment. And so I was wondering how many other people are unaware of the work that HBCUs are doing, and why aren't we, right? And what do we consider to be the best? And where are these ideas of what is best, where does it come from? And how does that translate into things that we do in society? And so that's really how I kind of got to this dissertation project. My journey to education was through my experience as a college advisor. So initially I was like a lot of students who came in as pre-med, pre-health, and I thought I was going to be a doctor. Soon realized that I preferred to think about society, and so sociology became a prominent course for me that I really enjoyed. And I really started to question, like, how is our society set up? How did it become set up this way? Does it have to be this way? And that's what got me on this path towards education eventually. After I graduated from Berkeley, I went on to work for Destination College Advising Corps, which is a part of the National College Advising Corps that places recently graduated students at low-income high schools. And I went to work at a high school in my hometown, and I discovered my love for education. I really enjoyed working with my students. I really enjoyed helping them apply to college and think about college, especially for students who had never considered college before. And while doing that, I started to recognize some of the issues with access and all the barriers that students would face. And I wanted to be a part of trying to make a change, and so that there would be less barriers and that more students would have access to college, especially those who are underrepresented in education. And so that's how I ended up on this journey here to this PhD program. And what was the final question, Dr. Allan?
What happens next? Where next?
Where next? So I am really hoping to go into a role as a tenure track professor. I love all parts of it. I love the teaching, but I also love the research and I love the service as well. And so I feel like it's the perfect role that connects all the three things that I've been enjoying through my experience as a doctoral student and through my journey through my own education. And so I guess now we can take it on back
Turn it back to Chris.
To hers.
All right, thank you both. We'll move on to our third presentation right now. And our next session is called Getting Away With and Getting Rid of Yellowface, Contemporary Musical Theater and Asian Americans, which will feature Donatella Galella, Associate Professor of Theater, Film, and Digital Production at UC Riverside, interviewed by Sean Metzger, Professor and Head of the PhD Program in Theater and Performance Studies at UCLA. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have Donatella here with us at UCLA. I'm just going to jump right in, and I will try to muster Kiana's enthusiasm for the profession again. Donatella, can you describe your research project and talk about why it's important to think about yellowface right now?
Absolutely. First, though, I wanted to say thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity at UCLA, and to my fabulous mentor, Sean. I feel so lucky to get to work with you. That'll come up in your next question. But to answer your first one, my project is answering two big questions. They are, how does yellowface persist in musicals on stage in the 21st century? And how have Asian Americans worked to counter yellowface? And I've found that non-Asians are putting on these stereotypical Asian performances in ways that aren't as obvious as yellow makeup and taped up eyes in professional productions as often as they used to pre-2000. And what they do instead is they commodify Asianness into things, kimonos, swords, ways of having a mincing kind of walk, gong sounds, and so on, which allows for an easier disavowal of like, I'm not being that racist, look at me put on and take it off easily. The second mode is having a multiracial cast in fantasy Asia. And the third mode is by saying that I am self-consciously funny and racist. Look at how ironic it is. So this enables all the yellowface to continue. And I didn't want my research to focus just on white nonsense. So my research also highlights what, I am conducting interviews with Asian American actors and finding out how have they navigated stereotypical roles that they've played and having to be in shows that have yellowface at them. And then what are artists doing to re-script yellowface, whether it's revising an old musical or literally writing a new one. I think it's important to study yellowface because it's deeply entangled with anti-Asian racism, both representationally and materially. And it has gone so under the radar for the most part, in contemporary discourse. And so I'm interested in why does it continue? And frankly, it's because it's profitable and pleasurable for a lot of white people. And that might be uncomfortable for some folks to recognize, but I think that's why it's so important to figure out why is that the case and what can we do to stop it?
I love the phrase white nonsense. Can you talk a little bit about how specifically being at UCLA or in Los Angeles in general helps the project or helps you think about the kind of work you're doing?
Yeah, so first, I am so happy I get to work with you, Sean, and to engage with your research on 19th century yellowface, because a lot of my research requires that I have to look at that historical through line and figure out, how did this start? What were the original tropes? Why was that the case? How has that changed over time? But what elements have also stayed the same? And then there are other folks at UCLA like Lucy Burns, who have written on Miss Saigon, and her research has been so important to me because I think what I'm arguing is that something changed after there were the protests of the yellowface in Miss Saigon. So I'm so happy to get to connect with her again. And being at UCLA, it has meant that I've also reconnected with people like Raymond Knapp in music, and we're hosting this symposium on AAPI pedagogy and performance, which again, Sean is part of. So that's just exciting to have all these opportunities to get to attend exciting programming, like that screening of the anime Wong film, Daughter of Shanghai on Nitrate. That was so cool. And to just literally see how it can be otherwise through that kind of programming. And then the last part for LA, getting to be where East West Players is, the oldest Asian American theater in the country, is so special to me. It's life affirming. And your question made me reflect on how during this ongoing pandemic, I haven't been to the theater that much, but when I have gone, it's consistently back to East West Players. And that's because no one else is doing what they're doing. They did a multiracial production of Assassins. Like, that's basically unheard of. They did a queer trans musical called Interstate. So that's what's just so wonderful about being in LA and working with UCLA, just having these major touchstones and people that I can learn from in this field.
That's amazing. And if you were to think about your work as a whole, which covers so much ground, if you were to pick one musical that people should look at to think through this issue, what would it be and why?
Yeah, so I know you have some DHH issues, but I have to say Soft Power. I'm obsessed with it. It's David Henry Hwang's new musical with Ginny Tazori, and my answer is a twofer because Soft Power is a reversal of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, The King and I. So instead of a white nanny going into Thailand to try to fix that country, Soft Power imagines, what if a Chinese theater producer taught Hillary Clinton how she could improve the United States and fix this country? And so I love the concept of it, and I love how it flips yellowface on its head. Literally, there are Asian American cast members in whiteface, and they're performing stereotypes of white Americans. And the show imagines a future where there's been the downfall of the United States after the 2016 election and the rise of China. And it imagines this musical as a piece of Chinese propaganda that's the most popular musical in the world. And so I love the comedy of it. I love the flipping of racial hierarchy. And I love how meta it is because it's like a musical within a play. And it invites us to think critically about our love of musicals and how seductive their ideology is, and how we can just be swayed by Orientalism, but instead it's like this counter-Orientalism. And it just makes me so happy. I've seen it 4 times. I hope it goes to Broadway. But then my last question about it is, does it work though? Because it seems to me on my research of reception that Asian Americans understand the critique it's making of musical theater and of American liberalism, and as well as the systemic white supremacy of this country. And then for other people with white privilege, a lot of them kind of just see the surface of the show and they're like, oh yeah, China is bad and hypocritical. This is such a patriotic show. I love the United States. It's so racially diverse, embracing Asian Americans. So I'm really interested in this as an example that just like really counters yellowface.
Great. So join me and Donatella to work on my DHH issues with soft power. We're going to turn it back to Christopher now. Thank you very much, Donatella. It's really, again, a pleasure for you to be here for us.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And we are now at our final presentation. It's going by so quickly. All right, so our final session is Indigenous Blackness in the Americas, the Queer Politics of Self-Making, Garifuna, New York, with Paul Joseph Lopez Oro, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Smith College, interviewed by Maylee Blackwell, Professor and Vice Chair of the Cesare Chavez Department of Chicano, and Central American Studies. Welcome to Paul and Joseph, Paul and Maylee.
Hola, Pablo. Nice
Hola.
to see you.
Nice to see you.
¿Qué tal? I'm so excited that you're here with us for the IAC Fellowship. I think your work does such an amazing job at pushing the boundaries of ethnic studies, of Latinx studies, of Black diasporic studies, of Indigenous studies. So tell us a little bit about your research and how you came to your project.
Thank you so much. Just want to start off with saying, Wiki Rabunyu, buenas tardes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I am incredibly honored to be in the company of so many phenomenal scholars and thinkers. My work, which I'm currently in the heaviness of transforming the dissertation into the first book manuscript, is a critical ethnography and an ethnography that looks both at the contemporary histories, but a particular transgenerational history of Garifuna New Yorkers, a Black Indigenous community who have lived and reside in the United States since before 1950s through vis-a-vis US imperialism, United Fruit Company. And I'm particularly really interested in the ways in which gender and sexuality informs and shapes how transgenerational Garifuna New Yorkers of Central American descent negotiate, contest, and self-fashion their multiple subjectivities as Black, as Indigenous, and as Latinx, but the Latinx, right, on the East Coast not being particularly Puerto Rican or Dominican, but being Central American, Caribbean folks, right? And how does that even complicate notions of Latinidad, but also complicates notions of who's Indigenous and who's Black, right? And the idea of who gets to be both at the same time. So I look at public performances. I'm particularly building on the work of Omishik and Natasha Tinsley, Jafari Allan, to think about the queerness of Indigenous Blackness, to think about what is it about the queering of those negotiations and those contestations that really disrupt normative structures of violence.
Ooh, I want to know more about it all. I want to know what's revealed by that intersection of Black, Indigenous, and queer, all the lusciousness, the Central Americanness you're bringing to Caribbean studies, the Blackness, the different Indigenous Blackness you're bringing to all the different intersections, and what's queer in the project? How does this all intersect?
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that question. You know, a couple of things come to mind, right? I think in particular, Garifuna folks who have been, you know, and I think at this point in our kind of contemporary history, Garifuna folks are very well known, right? They're hemispherically very much politically active, especially in Central America's Caribbean coast around land tenure, land rights. And they're actually one of the first Black Indigenous communities in the Americas to actually be recognized by a nation state as Indigenous, right? So in 1987, with the multicultural constitutional reforms in Latin America, Garifuna folks, particularly in Nicaragua, are literally at the forefront of articulating Indigenous Blackness. This is why the manuscript is so incredibly rooted in this idea of Black people being indigenous to the Americas, with or without a material connection to the land. And in fact, I argue very much so that Garifuna New Yorkers are always already making ancestral land in New York City by public performances. And that's where the queerness for me comes up, right? The queerness for me emerges in these public performances, particularly because not only are Garifuna women at the forefront of this hemispheric movement of preserving Garifuna identity, culture, and history, but LGBTQ plus Garifuna folks, right, are literally the leaders of cultural preservation in New York City, right? One of the first Garifuna dance companies that become a space of cultural preservation, but it also becomes a space of HIV/AIDS activism, is founded by a Garifuna lesbian woman who leaves Honduras, migrates from Honduras to New York City in the 80s, not solely because of anti-Black racism, but also simultaneously homophobia, right? So these are the stories that the manuscript is trying to center and excavate, and particularly because I think and this is why I really go back to the work of Tinsley and Allan, it's because there's something, the queerness here that I'm thinking through is one that's not always centering or thinking solely about same-sex desire, but it's constantly thinking it as a practice of resistance to the normative, right? And the violence, right? The violence at the heteronormative, but the normativity, right? Of even racial and ethnic compartmentalizations, right? So like when Garifuna New Yorkers are saying, check other, right? Garifuna, right? For me, that's a queering of the census document, right? That's an entirely act of queering a document that says, Garifuna folks don't fit here, right? I problematize that a lot because it's also, there's something about Latinidad that, and particularly mestizaje, that continues to be really present in as we think about Central Americans in the US, but when we think about Latinidad. So even this idea of like racial mixture, Julie Hooker writes about racial Latinx exceptionalism, right? So there's something about even Garifuna New Yorkers reproducing that narrative, even if it's for a Garifuna kind of identity.
Yes, we are dealing with it in effect in LA. I don't know if you've been hearing about all the anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and homophobic Latinx city council members who we are putting on blast.
Yes.
But I'm thinking about the queer politics also of community making and self-making. I want to know a little bit more how that plays out in Garifuna, New York. This is such an important process of breaking down all the silos, but there is something about queer self-making, community making, that's something I'm really fascinated in your work.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And in fact, that was the beauty of kind of even this whole dissertation project, right? Every time anyone writes a dissertation perspective, there's already, this idea of like, what may I possibly find? And I did not expect the queerness, and I didn't expect the queer kinship in particular. And I was really drawn to the queer kinship in Garifuna New York spaces because it's actually one of those, to borrow from the work of Rosamund King, right? El secreto abierto, right? Like this really open secret, particularly when there's a certain kind of gender and sexuality politics around heteronormativity, right? So there was something really interesting as I was doing my field work, right? That in fact, most of my interlocutors, most of my spaces were in subaltern geographies in Brooklyn and in the Bronx, right? I'm in people's basements. I'm in a church basement, right? Like there's a whole Garifuna LGBTQ social club in a Pentecostal church, right? On Mother Gaston Boulevard that's been functioning since 1989. And it's still very much functioning, right? And what the queer kinship in particular, right, leads me also to uncover kind of this hemispheric activism around HIV/AIDS politics, but also even around sexual education, around notions of even like queer identity and what does that queer identity mean in terms of Garifuna dance. So this is where I'm also like in this kind of performance studies terrain that I'm a little nervous about, but here we are, right? So I think there's something incredibly important about how my interlocutors thought about Garifuna dance, both as a project of ancestral memory and cultural preservation, but also a project that let them express their queerness through their embodied performances, right? So there's something about the queer kinship that allows for this sense of not necessarily pride, but a sense of safe space, right? There's something about a sense of home within our culture that allows for this idea, right? Because one of the interlocutors, as I was like getting ready for today, was like, brought me back to this moment where, you know, Garifuna folks in New York were saying, well, there's not a queer space for us. There isn't queer spaces for Garifuna folks to be Garifuna, to dance punta with each other, right? To be able to do all of these important expressions of Black indigeneity. And these dance companies, right, these subaltern geographies, right, the church, the Pentecostal church on Mother Gaston, right, the basement on Eastern Parkway become these spaces where queer Garifuna folks build community with one another, but build long-lasting and messy, right, messy, complicated relationships, but there's a support for queer identified Garifuna folks in that space.
Well, I guess if we're not uncomfortable, we're not doing the work. So I appreciate what you're saying. And I'm thinking so much how your work shifts the fields of Black studies, Latinx studies, queer studies, and Indigenous studies. Like, what does it mean to be an Indigenous migrant? How do we be guests and make ancestral connection? Wanted to know, just with our final question, if you can touch on those intersections. Did you have to kind of refigure the field just to be able to talk about this? The fields. Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm actually really grateful to be in conversation in those fields, particularly because those fields push my thinking, and also I'm happy to push back. I think pushback is really important, particularly because I think particularly one of the afterlives of mestizaje that I'm thinking through, and I'm specifically thinking about Latinx studies here, and what folks, you know, also refer to as U.S. Central American studies, that they're one of the persistent ways of how Central American mestizaje remains anti-Black and anti-Indigenous is that Garifun folks become a folklore. They become a caricature of Central American expression, right? And I think one thing about that is that there's a void, right? There's an erasure, there's a silencing, right? There's also a long history of marking the Caribbean coast as the sole bearer of Blackness in Central America, right? So this is why even in the racialized geographies of Central America, El Salvador gets to say, aquí no hay negros, right? We don't have Black people here, right? Because the Caribbean, the Black Atlantic, right, to echo Gilroy, isn't present. And I think there's something particularly important that Garifuna folks are doing in New York City to really disrupt, right? Even like Afro-Latinidad, right? I'm working on this chapter entitled Decolonizing Afro-Latinidad, right? Particularly because Latinx Caribbean people are not the sole bearers of Blackness in the Americas, right? You don't have to be, you know, a Spanish-speaking Black person from the Dominican Republic, right? But in fact, the diaspora is much wider than that and broader. So in particular, I'm constantly thinking about how to Garifuna New Yorkers really negotiate within those identities, but also generationally, right? I'm particularly interested in also highlighting the fact that this is a Black Indigenous community that's been in the US, right? That has a long trajectory, not only through the African diaspora and the Indigenous diaspora, but to also think about the diaspora within US imperialism, and in particular, the United Fruit Company, right? So it's a whole bunch of stuff, right? Like it's so much that, in fact, that I'm trying to push and think through, but also to even, you know, what is even this project of Afro-Latinidad doing, right? And when Garifuna New Yorkers reject it, they're rejecting it because they're also folding into a certain kind of project around Black indigeneity that's incredibly important, right? And there's one thing in particular that I use a lot is personal essays and even oral histories in my project. So I turn to when moments of Garifuna activists are referring to themselves as negras indígenas, right? And even in New York City, right? The terminology, the thinking around Indigenous Blackness is incredibly important. And I love that they disrupt even this idea of land, right? I've had many interlocutors say, you know, I don't need to be in Honduras, right, to be able to have a connection to my ancestors. I bring my ancestral land with me, and that's where I look at the intersections of.
Gorgeous, gorgeous, and yes, it unfixes land. It makes it less static. So I think we might have gone just a little over. So I'm going to pass it back to Christopher, and thank you. Thank you so much, Pablo Jose.
Thank you both. So now we'll take about 15 minutes or so and we'll do a Q&A. So I'd love to invite all of our scholars to join us again, Caitlin, Donatella, Kiana, and Pablo. And I'll also put a reminder that for everyone watching, if you'd like to ask our scholars a question, you can put the question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to be greedy. I'm not even going to look at the Q&A box for a second because I want to start off with my own question. So, I mean, Caitlin, your work is so, labor is so central to your work. And I was hearing that emphasis next to Donatella when Donatella was talking about how Yellowface, you know, is driven in part by profit and pleasure. And then going over to Pablo, and Pablo is talking about the role of the United Fruit Company in Central America. And so I was wondering maybe we could just go down the line and talk about the role that labor and profit play in relationship to the various subjects that are being discussed by all of you, and Kiana as well. I'm sure that also is a layover. So should we just start with Donatella?
Sure. Yeah. So your prompt makes me first think that about these musicals that have these yellow-faced legacies like The King and I, and how, or Miss Saigon, and a lot of the continuing justification for them and their Orientalist work is that they provide all these jobs for Asian American, Pacific Islander actors who are seen as this like lump together. So that's frustrating because I wish we could have a system by which everyone's basic needs are met so that we wouldn't have to have that kind of exploitation and decide between paying your rent and like selling your soul doing this performance. But, you know, on the other hand, researchers like Celine Shimizu and like Lucy Burns, when they interview these actors, and when I've done that as well, we find that people find a way to live with those roles and they try to find dignity. And that is another kind of work as well. They're kind of going above and beyond in some way of not just like memorizing the script and they're blocking, but trying to find a way to live off of and live with this, and then arguing that having that line on their resume will then help them get the next job where they hope that they can make a better intervention in dismantling systemic white supremacy on stage.
Yeah, as you were speaking, like form of coerced labor continued to come into my head, like capitalist systems pushing us into various forms of coerced labor, which maybe will be a segue to Caitlin.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great segue. Thank you so much for this question, Christopher. It's really wonderful. You know, and thinking about the outing programs, you know, I'm just looking at the Bay Area outing program. This was one of dozens, if not potentially over 100 outing programs, because these programs operated largely through Indian boarding schools. And the whole goal was to, you know, take Indian kids, literally contract out their labor. And, you know, for young men, that could be working on a farm or, you know, working in an orchard. And for young women, it was always this domestic work. And thinking about profit, the outing as it was imagined was an idea of like trying to, I mean, as misguided as it was really trying to get, you know, Native children to become like Americanized. And then eventually, as you can imagine, it took off and it became like 100% exploitative. It was just all about like, okay, how can we get cheap labor? So if we look at schools like the Phoenix Indian School, or if we look at Sherman Institute down in Southern California, these schools were literally supported by local businesses for the purpose of being able to access cheap Indian labor. Like that's literally, those are the people who are backing it. So it was all about profit. It was all about like really trying to exploit, you know, these systems. And I think the thinking at the time was that this was the best opportunity for Native people, and that Native people should be so lucky to have these good jobs. But in reality, we see that it is highly exploitative. And that whole idea of really putting Indian kids to work, whether on campus in boarding schools, because kids literally ran boarding schools ultimately. So they were, making their own uniforms and cleaning the place. They were building the buildings that they lived in, and then extending that same process through these outing programs and extending it to places like, the Bay Area or even Los Angeles, which also had a lot of outing women coming from, Sherman down in Riverside, California. But it was always about profit. And that was kind of their solution at that early 20th century time to like the Indian problem, was like put Indians to work. So thankfully, that is not the imperative anymore, but this was really connected to what later tapped into Indian relocation programs, which were also about vocational training and all of that. So I think that's a really excellent question, Christopher, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
And I think that's a perfect segue to Pablo as well, especially again, like that phrasing, exploitation of cheap indigenous labor. Like it's echoed transnationally, and I'm sure Pablo, you can speak to that as within the context of Central America.
Absolutely. And thank you for that question. The reason I brought up the United Fruit Company is I wanted to also echo the decades-long history of Garifuna New Yorkers, Garifuna folks in the U.S., and actually New Orleans becomes the first port of entry for Garifuna Central Americans. New Orleans and the Caribbean coast of Central America is deeply tied, right, to the monopoly of what the United Fruit Company created in its banana plantations. But in particular, that migration and that trans-circular migration of Garifuna laborers in the 50s really sets off multiple waves, right, of folks leaving Central America's Caribbean coast, but going into, right, the urban spaces of New York, right? There's a particular reason historically why New York has the largest Garifuna population in the US, right? And that has everything to do with the capitalist invention of the United Fruit Company, right? So it's really important to echo that history as we continue to also live in the afterlife, right? And in fact, I argue this a bit in the book, is that we continue to live in the afterlife of the United Fruit Company, right? So in many ways, the practices that United Fruit Company enacted, which were very Jim Crow-like, continue, right? In terms of labor, in terms of the work that Garifuna New Yorkers engage in, right? So it's an important piece of historical context that needs to be highlighted. Okay.
Kiana, can you help me make those connections as well?
Well, I can see one thing that keeps coming up in my research is this idea of prestige, and prestige is profitable. And so oftentimes this pursuit of prestige for universities leads to selectivity, and oftentimes it places the needs of prestige over the needs of students. And so in that way, I think capitalism is operating in that schools may have a hard time wanting to dismantle this idea of prestige, because it can lead to a decrease in students wanting to attend, right? The more prestigious you are, the more students want to attend, the more money they get through tuition, money, and things like that. And so that is one connection I see, is this idea of profitability, prestige, and selectivity.
Thank you all. I'm gonna jump really quickly into the questions from our audience first, the first one is addressed to Donatella. And the question says, thanks so much for sharing about your exciting research. How do you feel the question of Asian American representation changes in the context of different performance institutions? For example, how does soft power's narrative resonate differently between its productions in LA and New York? And what would it mean to go to Broadway?
Thanks, Janine and Christopher. Okay, so there's so much to say here, so I'll only highlight a couple of things. So one is that when it opened in LA, that was in 2018, amid the kind of start of the Trump family separation policy and a lot of, again, media discourse on gun violence. So I think that was coloring the production, on top of how that version was a co-production between Center Theater Group and East West Players. So the fact that there was a partnership with this Asian American specific theater, but it was in the space at Center Theater Group. So it wasn't in Little Tokyo. So that affected who was going to that space and coloring that experience on top of what's happening in the real world, because literally there were songs like Good Guy with a Gun also, that's like and then in the audience you could think about like what's happening outside of the theater with regard to mass gun violence. And the show, when it was at LA, it was like much more satirical and had lots of targets on the United States for pointing out its homophobia, climate change denialism, our healthcare for-profit industry jokes like how they can't save an Asian American character who gets stabbed because like we can't find his like health insurance card. So all of that actually got edited out in the version when it moved to the public theater in New York City. And that version is actually darker and much more centered on xenophobic anti-Asian racism. And so it cut out some of these other more comical elements, and it took quite seriously the threat and reality of anti-Asian violence. And the public, it's like it's downtown, but it's not in Chinatown. And the public has this history of bringing like radical new musicals, from Hair at its start to things like Bringing to Noise, Bringing to Funk, Fun Home, Hamilton, right? Although issues with Hamilton, but it has this reputation for being radical. So I think that was coloring that production as well. What would it mean for Broadway? This is weird because we're not in a Trump presidency anymore. So the fear and a lot of feelings that people had, especially some white audience members, they couldn't deal with actually seeing a Hillary Clinton character on stage. It was very hard for them to process the criticisms that the show was making of the United States. So I wonder that with more time passing, if the show goes to Broadway, are people more able to accept the criticisms of the United States as a fundamentally racist institution built on genocide, dispossession, and slavery, as well as xenophobia? I hope so, but I also think they are in the process of changing the show and trying to make it less specific historically, because that's what happens as time passes. And I think that's what's going to help the show last longer, as opposed to just being in its moment. And the thing is, that resonates with what happened with The King and I, because that's about like the actual Thai king of like King Mongkok and like Anna Leowens, and like the details about them, that wasn't real in the musical. It like messed up their ages and like took Anna's lies as reality. And so I think they're going to use that aspect and then map that on to the new revision of soft power, again, to make it like less historically accurate, because that's what propaganda does. And so I think they're going to do that intentionally. Last thing I'll say is, if it goes to Broadway, I think it means it'll be the second original musical by an Asian American to ever get to Broadway.
Wow, that's fascinating. The next question, I'm actually going to merge two questions that are in the chat. It's for Pablo, and the questions are: how do you situate your work within the growing field of Garifuna studies and scholarship? And can you tell us a little bit about your research questions or preliminary findings regarding the Garifuna community in Los Angeles as opposed to the community in New York?
Yes, thank you for that question. And a big shout out to Rebecca Epstein for that question. I really appreciate it. In fact, in full transparency, the Garifuna community in LA is the reason I applied for this phenomenal fellowship, particularly because it was going to give me an opportunity to see a different side of the US Garifuna history, right, and experience. Particularly, I think there's a very interesting different racial dynamic happening in Los Angeles than in New York City. So it's really interesting to see, and particularly the Garifuna community in LA are mostly Belizeans, right? So that's a different, even much more added nuance to the complexities around even language, right? The relationship of Garifuna folks with African Americans, but also in the company of West Indians and Creole folks from Central America. So it's a very fascinating kind of community. In fact, there's a Garifuna Museum in LA. I can't think of another Garifuna Museum besides the one in Dangriga, Belize in the Americas. There's definitely not a Garifuna Museum in New York. So there's definitely a big pluses to check out and learn more. I'm always also interested in looking at like local activism around cultural preservation for Garifuna folks in LA. So I'm really excited about that. And then Garifuna studies, I think that's a great question. I think it's a complicated one because I think a lot of folks would situate Garifuna studies in different places and different moments. There's certainly a very much US-based anthropologist kind of ethnographic work on Garifuna folks in Central America. Mark Anderson, who's at UC Santa Cruz, Sarah England. So how do I answer this question? It's a complicated one because Garifuna studies in many ways can be very US centric by US academics, if that makes any sense, right? So there's a little bit of a devaluing of Central American academics when I think about Garifuna studies or when I think about how people engage the field. And I would love to see much more Garifuna scholars in Garifuna studies. So I turn to the work of Joseph Palacio. I turn to the political activism of Miriam Miranda, right? As different moments of not including, but like they're being foundational to Garifuna studies, right? So there's a bit of hierarchies and complicated notions around institutions and who gets to be part of the field and not. Yeah.
Thank you. We're coming to our closing time but I want to pop in 2 last questions if I can for Caitlin and Kiana. The first one, Kiana, I've been thinking about how you were speaking to the impact of race and racism and how that influences decision-making. And I was wondering, as it relates to your particular research, what are certain rectifications that you think could be had there as students deal with anti-Black racism as it impacts their decision-making in relationship to higher education?
Sure. Well, what I think there needs to be an acknowledgement of the effect that it's had. I think one of the biggest problems is that it's not something that I think has been talked about or even really considered. HBCUs are Black spaces, right? And in a lot of ways, many PWIs are white spaces. And I don't think that is something that is acknowledged or considered. Even what I'm finding in my research is a lot of times HBCUs are seen by students as Black spaces, while PWIs are seen as colleges, right? They're seen as neutral spaces, and people don't always recognize how race is affecting the experiences that students are having at these types of institutions. And so one way is to just acknowledge that it's a thing, it exists, and it should be addressed.
And then my last question for Caitlin is I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more to shifts in how labor has been gendered through the past centuries. You have been talking about particularly the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries and indigeneity in those centuries kind of being spoken about. So I was wondering if you can talk to those shifts.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Really part of my, book project and even thinking about Indian labor and boarding schools as a whole, when you talk about that, it's really understood. I mean, we have to understand that the whole goal of boarding schools, of outing programs, was really to transform Native people. It was meant to sort of break down family structures. It was really meant to, break down any kind of communal structures, much more individualism, thrifty workers. Like that was really kind of the goal. So when we think about, gendered labor through the outing program or other programs, it's really thinking about how that was not in any way traditional in a sense for a lot of these Native women and from the communities that they came from. But that was what they were trained in at boarding schools. So all of these girls, they wouldn't have had training coming to the outing program, but they would have been trained in boarding school. So from a very young age, they would have been taught to cook and sew and clean and scrub. And these were basically lauded as femininity, as domesticity. And these are all Euro-American standards of domesticity. So in thinking about that question of gendered labor, we have to understand that this was enforced onto Indian children and into Indian families. And it's really, I think, that much more poignant when we're able to find like the resistance and everything, because we're realizing that everything is kind of coerced, whether it's just, these jobs that girls got, or, the kind of labor that they were forced to do. So I think in looking at the outing program, I try to find those moments, and there's many moments actually where Native women are, kind of resisting and fighting for their own autonomy and their own rights and the way they want to live their lives. And simultaneously, again, like living in the city and trying to experience new things and having money so they can buy, I don't know, clothes that they really wanted at the time, stuff like that. But yeah, it's very much in looking at, how labor has been gendered. And also, I think how some of these women were trying to break that cycle for themselves and also their children. And the kind of one thing that I'm somewhat happy to look on when I think about the outing program is a lot of the kids that, these women had, their daughters weren't also forced into domestic work. Their children weren't necessarily forced into boarding school. So that was largely what outing matrons wanted to do. They were able to kind of have more autonomous lives. So eventually, breaking away from the boarding school, breaking away from outing programs, and then being able to live and really create community in the Bay Area, because that's another final kind of moment of my book, is thinking about how these Native women are really actually creating the Bay Area Indian community as we know it today. So anyway, thank you so much for your question, Christopher. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all. I feel like I need to lie on the couch right now and like just let it all sink in. So much brilliant cutting edge work coming from all of you. Thank you so much. Caitlin, Donatella, Kiana, Pablo. I'm going to read a closing statement and then we could all enjoy the rest of our days. So this concludes the Fall Forum. On behalf of the Institute of American Cultures, thank you all to all of our speakers and interviewers, the UCLA Development Events Team, the American Indian Studies Center, Asian American Studies Center, Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies, and the Chicano Studies Research Center. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, UCLA Alumni Diversity Programs and Initiatives, the Department of American Indian Studies, Asian American Studies, African American Studies, and Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies. Please take a moment to fill out the survey on your Zoom screen. If you'd like to learn more about ways to support the scholarship being conducted at the Institute of American Cultures, please consider checking out the How to Give page on our website. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and let's stay in touch. All right, take care everyone, bye.